So hello everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. This is the sixth cycle of conversations, and today I am very glad and honored to introduce you to Dak Kopec. Dak Kopec is an architectural psychologist with a PhD in environmental psychology, 2 master's degrees, one in community psychology and another in architecture, and he holds a bachelor's degree in health sciences. He is currently a full professor in the School of Architecture at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dak has authored several books, including Environmental Psychology for Design and his most recent publication, Person-Centered Healthcare Design and Architectural Factors for Infection and Disease Control. He is a 2 times Polsky Prize winner and has been awarded an honorary fellowship to ASID. Dak, thank you so much for accepting this invitation, for being here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Good, bad, or indifferent. There is a young lady with a black shirt and another young lady with a green shirt that are in my screen. So I will be looking for you two for affirmations when I have questions like, can you hear me? Did I stop? Just raise your hand or do something because you're in my screen. So thank you. All right, so let me go ahead and share. Sharing is caring, so I'm going to care and share, and got all these panels open here. So here's where we are going to start. We're having our conversations on corporeal architecture, which is an awfully big term, and hopefully we will come to some consensus after all of these discussions as to what does this mean? How does it apply to me? So let's go ahead and get started. And since I'm your very first person, I think that it's important that you understand who I am and how it is that I come to design, because as we've just heard, I have a very unique background when it comes to design. So I'm just going to start with my story, take 1, because, well, my story has multiple takes, because if at first you don't succeed, you try again. And that's been my motto. So I actually started out at university. I was going to say college, but I understand that we in the United States, college and university are used interchangeably. When I was 17 years old, I skipped a year of high school and ended up going into university a year early, supposedly going to be that prodigy that my parents wanted me to be. Unfortunately for them, I had different plans. But let me explain how I ended up getting into health sciences, because I think that this is going to be an important part of understanding where empathy comes into play and what it is that I bring to architecture. So to begin with, a little bit about myself. I was born with very severe asthma. And when I say severe, it was probably a 9 on a 10-point scale, basically allergic to everything in the world. I grew up in New England in the Massachusetts area, which is, the Boston is our main city. And we had seasons, which I absolutely loved. However, I was allergic to those seasons. And when I was growing up, which was in the 1970s, this is when I was in elementary preschool, it was in the 1970s, and there weren't the medications that are available today. So one of the medications they put me on was Alupent, and that was the strongest medication for people who had asthma. And because I was constantly having asthma attacks, I was using asthma. One of the most traumatizing experiences of my life was the day that I became immune to the Alupent. My parents were driving up to Maine to see my grandparents, who happened to live on the border of Maine and Canada. Thank God for that, because I had become immune to the Alupent. So there was no controlling the asthma attack. It was out of control. I can remember sitting in the back seat of the car, kneeling on the floor with my elbows on the back seat, chest pointed down so that I could breathe. And this was a really traumatizing, because I just kept squeezing that Alupent until it was completely empty. Ultimately, my parents got to Maine. It was about an 8-hour drive. And the asthma attack wasn't subsiding. And so my mom ended up driving me to the nearest emergency room, which happened to be in New Brunswick, Canada. And to this day, I consider Canada as being the reason that I'm alive today, because they had medications that were legal in Canada that were not yet legal in the United States. So they were able to control the asthma attack. And then from that point on, my parents were driving me back and forth to Canada, which is where my doctors were, because the medical system in the United States was not yet up to par. Why that's important. There was another young girl who was my age, who also had asthma. She ended up dying at 14, complete system failure from complete exhaustion from the chronic asthma attacks. Now, mind you, medications have come a long way since the 1970s and even the 80s. It really wasn't until the late 90s, well, maybe middle 90s, that a lot of the medications for asthma came about. So now it's nowhere near the disease that or condition that it was. But there are traumatizing events. That young lady dying, knowing that I was that close to being her. And as luck would have it, my grandparents lived in Maine. So I think that became a reason why I wanted to move forward and try to help people like myself. And so one of the things that I learned at a very young age was that exercise and physical activity helped to reduce the effects of the asthma attacks. And that was the reason that I went into health sciences. My whole goal was to try to figure out how it was that we could make kids who had respiratory illnesses help them to deal with the effects of their chronic health condition and ultimately lessen the effects. So to my mind, that was going to be through physical activity or through health. So that's how I ended up in health sciences. Unfortunately, my very first job outside of health sciences was at a community clinic. And I realized that a lot of the systems in the United States really do promote racism and prejudice. And that became a real problem for me because I'm very much of an egalitarianism, and meaning that I believe in absolute equality for everyone. And I didn't see that. And that was my motivation for going to get my master's in community psychology. And it was during that time that one of my professors had said to me that that really what I was doing was environmental psychology, that I was really interested in that. And of course, as I told you, I was that my parents thought that I was going to be that child prodigy who was going to be like, doing great things at age 22. Well, unfortunately, I'm now like around age 27 after I dropped out of school and did the 10-year plan to get my undergraduate degree. So the idea of going on for a PhD was never even remotely in my horizon. But when my professor told me this and showed me a couple of articles written by environmental psychologists, I'm like, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a way that we can increase awareness for people who have chronic health conditions to be just like everyone else and to live like everyone else. So how did I end up in design? Well, I certainly didn't do it through the university. I had to go and find that window, open it up and crawl on in with a mask on, because God knows I didn't want everybody to know that I wasn't really an architect and I wasn't really an interior designer, but here I am. So please accept me. So now I'm in take 2 of my career, which is then going back to school and getting a master's degree in architecture. So my pathway is definitely not traditional. And I think that it's important to understand where it is that I come from when I start to understand the built environment in relationship to people. And this is based off of systems thinking. And systems thinking has been used in psychology for a long time. Now, there are 3 different perspectives for systems thinking from the way that I see it. One is through research, the other is through practice, and the third is through design, which is what we do. Systems thinking in research is looking at problems and understanding them from the complexity of examining their relationships between the different components within the entire system itself. That's really hard to do in design or in research, because when we take a look at what research is, we can see that research is long and deep. Well, how does that then work with this aspect and then this aspect? That's where our problem comes from, because really a systems thinking is going horizontally, but ideally we want the depth as well. And so this is where our problem comes from, because we're always standing on the shoulders of giants, right? So if we're standing on the shoulders of giants, we're going long and deep. And so this is where my biggest problem has come from within research. And I try really hard to address that as much as I possibly can. And so that's where I start to look at practice. And practice is the holistic interdisciplinary perspective that draws upon various fields. Now, this could be things like business, engineering, ecology, and social sciences. Well, this is all great, but I'm looking at the built environment. All I've got is that school. I've got that trauma care center. I've got that shelter for battered women and children. You name the typology, that's what I've got to work with. And so when I look at systems thinking in design, I look at it as a method of developing designs for humans that draw upon our anatomy, our biology, our chemistry, our physiology, and our psychology. How does that all come together into me, which is my human condition, and then into art? Don't ever want to take art away from design. Art is an important aspect with metaphors and foreshadowing and symbolic representation. And all of that goes into our psychology and our understanding. And it's going to have an effect on our biology and our chemistry through neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, hormones, you name it. So that's important. Engineering is another important aspect. I mean, clearly we don't want the building to fall on our heads. That would certainly hurt our biology and our anatomy, wouldn't it? We'd end up with a little bit of a headache. Not a good thing. So we do need to consider the engineering, and we also need to think about technology and how is technology being used? What's the intended effects of technology, but also what are the unintended effects of technology? During wildfires, during earthquakes, or other natural disasters, we can lose power. And if we lose power, we lose technology. So what are the unintended consequences for that? And so these are some of the things that I think about when I'm taking I am taking a look at design itself. So let me go ahead and clear that, empty that, move this. Come on, gotta move you guys out of the way. And we then take a look and we see that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. This is Gestalt perception of psychology. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But in order to understand that the whole is greater than the sum of its part, we have to accept that there are 6 principles. And right now, those 6 principles are everything is connected. It is 9 o'clock in the morning where I am. So I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with my cup of coffee in front of me. You guys are probably late afternoon, early evening. Some of you are getting a little tired. I haven't seen the young lady with the black shirt yawn yet, but I do see a cup of coffee in front of her. So that means that she's also interested in that caffeine fix as I am. That's our connection. So she and I are now connecting. Cheers to our coffee. Hey, thank you. I appreciate that. We are now connected. And so we have something going on right now because I can see them, and I can also see Elke, and I can see Maria. We also have, oh, thanks, Maria. We also are symbiotic. There's a relationship. The fact that the young lady in the black raised her cup to me showed that she validated what I was saying. That's a symbiotic relationship. I raised my cup, she raised her cup. That's the relationship we've created. Everything has these symbiotic relationships. We can't accept that every action I do is just going to happen in a vacuum. There's another action that's going to happen. And everything is unique. Tomorrow, there might be a thunderstorm during the presentation. Tomorrow, the power might be out and I'll have a hard time with this presentation. So right now, during this presentation, it's unique, and we have to understand that. Every cause has an intended and unintended cause, or effect, rather. So the intended effect is that you guys are going to gain something from this presentation, and you're going to start to think about design a little bit different. The unintended effect is that I may say something that is highly offensive. And when Maria puts this on YouTube, my emails might get blown up because somebody took offense to what it is that I said. Certainly wasn't my intent to do that. What's that?
Maybe mine too. Maybe mine too.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the unintended consequence to what we're doing. And we accept that consequence because we're doing it. Everything has boundaries. I'm very quick to let people know that I am technologically not very good. So I know my boundaries. When I go as part of a design team, I let the interior designer or the architect really take a look at art, and we have discussions about symbolism. We have discussions about metaphors, but that's really not the lane that I drive in. The lane that I am driving in really pertains to the psychology of how people are experiencing those environments. And those are my boundaries, and I accept my boundaries, and I don't try to play in somebody else's lane. And then everything is based off of a unique mental framework. I just told you a little bit about myself and an experience that I had that was traumatizing, because I truly thought that I was going to die at that point. And I was okay with that, believe it or not. I was very comfortable with the fact that, yeah, the asthma is probably going to kill me. And you know what? Maybe that's not such a bad idea, because I really did get tired of watching other people be able to play outside. And I can tell you another one of my experiences was during a spring day. And everybody was outside. All of my friends were outside flying kites. I couldn't go out there because the wind was blowing, and I'm allergic to pollen. And so every time I would go outside, I ended up with an asthma attack. And I can remember being in my bedroom on a hardwood floor. This is the 1970s, remember? So 1970s, shag carpeting was like the rage. I was in a room with high gloss paint on the walls because it's not porous, hardwood floors, and I was looking through my window at all of my friends playing outside, and they were flying a kite, and I couldn't. That's another one of the traumas that I remember. And I bring that with me as I move forward into my publications. So Maria talked a little bit about my publications, but I'm not going to go too much into depth with these publications, other than I remember the big sustainability movement, and I was like, oh my gosh, do you know that human health and the human condition is almost at odds with sustainability? And if you don't believe me, go to any hospital and look and see how much plastic they use, how much plastic is entering into our system. And where does the plastic come from? Oil, carbon. So that's where we have to take a look at these unintended consequences. But as you can see, I really am into the psychology, but I'm also very much into the biology. And so this is where the infection control comes from. I care about the individual, and I really think that one of the areas for design is in person-centered design. And this is where we go in and we design for specific people. In this particular case, we have somebody with a prosthetic leg who's learning how to walk. And how can I use design to help him learn how to use that leg? And so here's an example of a design attribute that we were looking at that could be incorporated in a therapeutic setting for people with prosthetics. I'm looking at health and well-being, health, of course, being that biological factor, well-being being that psychological factor. How do we keep people safe? And as you can see, there is that research component, because I am part of a university and that's what we have to do. But I'm also interested in what creates that place. So I talked to you about my affinity for Canada. Canada is the reason that I'm alive today. So Canada has a strong sense of attachment for me and a strong sense of meaning for me. So where do these meanings and attachments come from? Now that's a macro level, but there's also micro levels that come from attachment. And as I said to you, I do believe that art is important, and I do have a creative side. So I also have novels. Last year, I published my first novel, which is a fiction, and I have a second one coming out in the spring of next year. So I think that it's important that we always consider the art and the science in balance. And even as a researcher, as an individual myself, I think that I need to promote my art and science. So let's put this into context because I'm not really into big, broad brushstrokes. So let's take a look at trauma-informed design. What is trauma and how is it that we design for people with trauma? I chose this image because there are 5 factors of this image that are quintessential, absolutely essential for design. Number 1, knowing what the issue is. This gentleman here has got 2 transfemoral amputation. Transfemoral just means that the cut was right across the femoral bone. What does that mean? It means his knee, his knee and his ankles have to be used through movement. That means that he's got to swing his hip to get the knee to move up, and then he has to be able to maneuver the hip and his muscles up there in order to get this ankle to fall the way it is. What does that mean for design? Ramps, bad ramp. Hills are going to be hard. So think about the biomechanics when something is being moved. We have muscles that enable us to do things. So that's the first thing that I'm noticing. The next thing that I'm noticing is how high this arm is. He needs that arm because he's going to have to use his upper body strength combined with the muscles in his hip and his quadriceps to get him off of this chair. That's an important thing. What's the third thing that I'm looking at? How high this back is. Anybody who has gone through trauma is going to be hypervigilant. But you know what? As much as Elko tries, she is not, I am so sorry. She is not an owl. So what does that mean? That means that she cannot turn her head all the way around. So we have to protect the back of their head so that he doesn't come up and somebody go whack behind him. Now, that's my third thing. My next thing that I'm looking at is this green wall out here. Now, I love that it's a green wall. Why do I like that it's a green wall? No, it's not because of biophilia. It's because he can control what is coming in through that site. So there's a personal sense of autonomy. Now, of course, the biophilia part is good. So we're not going to discount the biophilia. But the primary purpose is I don't have to worry about headlamps coming through the car or through the window because headlamps cause what? Flash of light. And you'll see a little bit later that flashes of light are a #1 trigger for trauma. And there's a lot of reasons, and that's one of the ubiquitous things, meaning that it spans multiple people. So those are some of the things that I'm looking at as I consider this design. Okay, what's going on here? My computer's frozen. Okay. So as I start to look at what trauma-informed design is, we always have to have an operational definition. I tell my students that operational definitions are so important because it helps you to defend your design. When we look at trauma-informed design, the operational definition is that it's an approach to design that takes into consideration the potential impact of physical spaces on an individual who's experienced trauma. But Elko's sitting here saying, well, that's all great, but what is trauma? You've answered trauma, or you've used trauma in your definition of trauma. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But it does make sense when we take a look at the physical spaces on individuals who've experienced trauma. So then we can say, what is trauma? So we have to say to ourselves, trauma is child abuse. So it's the here and now. So the here and now is this child right here is suffering from child abuse. The question is, how is it that he is internalizing that? And how is he going to internalize that as an adult if he never gets assistance for it? Spousal abuse. We often hear about women being abused by their husbands, and yes, that is the majority, but there are some women who abuse their husbands, and so there are some issues that we have to think about there. Hate crimes. We live in a very, very polarized world right now, and we see lots of wars being fought and lots of hate being spread. Violent crimes. Has somebody been affected by some form of a violent crime? We see people coming back from combat, so we see the PTSD coming into play. And then we also just see something as simple as a car accident. We've all been in different types of situations where our heart rate has increased, our breathing rate has increased. That usually is some form of a sign of trauma. So once we understand what trauma is, if you're going to engage in trauma-informed design, you have to accept 4 realities. Number 1, trauma does have a profound effect on a person's emotional and psychological well-being. Number 2, we as designers need to create spaces that are sensitive and supportive to the people who have experienced trauma. We not only need to think about the women who've been beat up, but how does this man feel? How is he internalizing the fact that he's being abused by his wife? It's an interesting concept to think about, and it's one of the reasons why I chose this particular image, because we don't always think about the other group of people. We need to support healing and well-being of the individuals without the risk of re-traumatizing. Can you believe that we actually can re-traumatize somebody? Yeah, we can. Usually it's done through the process and procedures. So we have to be very careful. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So if I don't happen to draw that direct connection, ask me that question afterward. And then we need to consider the unique needs and sensitivities of those who have been affected by trauma. I'm not going to go through all of this. I know this is being recorded, which means that you can push pause and you can read all of this on your own. But what I will say is your 2 top priorities are your emotional trauma and your physical trauma. Most of everything that I talked about falls into one of these categories. Sexual trauma, childhood trauma, and what I would then say elderly trauma, elder abuse. And I say that because children and elderly people process and internalize trauma very differently than an adult does. These fall under the categories of physical and emotional, just in a more specific. The other aspects are over here, which is a community or collective trauma. This could come from a marginalized group. So you might be looking at those people who have been enclaved. So we have in the United States, we have certain communities that are refugee communities. So we have large Somalian populations in one particular area. The gay and lesbian population tends to be clustered into a particular area. And they suffer from collective trauma, because what happens to one says it could happen to me. And that's a collective trauma. So when I'm in one of these quote unquote ghettoized communities, I have to be very aware that I'm one step away from whatever happens to Maria could happen to me. Other ways that this collective trauma happens is through natural disasters, acts of terrorism, mass violence, war, and of course, our pandemics. Now, what ends up going on here is we end up with a complex trauma, and this is when somebody becomes re-traumatized. And so this is when you've got multiple traumas that are coming together into some type of a reaction, which tends to be explosive. The last form is vicarious trauma, and this is when the trauma is so extreme and it plays to one of your fears. As a child growing up with asthma, not being able to breathe is a huge issue for me. In 1989, there was an earthquake in San Francisco where the double-decker freeways collapsed and people were trapped in their automobiles on the lower level. To me, that's not being able to breathe. I was terrified every time I was stuck in traffic to be stuck on an underpass or an overpass. So I would always kind of scooch up and try to get as close to the car in front of me. Or I would stop on the other side of it just in case that earthquake would come back and come down. So that's where you're seeing 2 different things happening together. And so when we look at trauma, there are the stages that we have to look at. There's the fight, flight, and freeze. This is while it's actually happening. After it's happened, there's a melancholy and self-doubt. And then there's a rational thought. So if you're designing a trauma care center, or you're designing a place for battered women and children, or you're designing a school for emotionally disturbed children, you need to be thinking about how this is playing out and where the child is going to be in that. For example, he or she may become triggered for some reason. She may have to be tackled, and I'm saying she because I'm actually recalling a specific event in my mind in which this person had to be subdued, and they had to her arms were held down by another person with a bear hug, and basically they had to hold on to her until she calmed down. After she did, she ended up with the melancholy and the self-doubt, the guilt. Oh my God, I can't believe I did that. All these people are going to make fun of me. You know, why did I do that? I'm so stupid. And then they're going to go into the rational thought. So when we look at these different stages of emotional healing, there isn't a whole lot we can do with this other than providing that support, getting rid of the guilt, getting rid of the shame. So I'm not going to go into all of this because, well, we don't have a whole lot of time to go through all of this. But again, this is something where you can pause later on and look at all of these factors. I will tell you that from my experience, most of the time people will get to the acceptance and they will sometimes feel the pain, but not that often. Oftentimes they'll recall it like a movie in their head, the event. They won't recall the actual experience of what it was like going through. So they create the image in their head, they remember it, but it's more like watching a television or a movie. And then it takes years of therapy, and that is not what we are, because I have never designed a therapist in my life. Although with AI, maybe I can design a therapist. It's an interesting perspective. But anyway, I digress. So these are your different stages of healing. So when I look at trauma-informed design, I realize that there is a gestalt happening. There's a generational perspective, there's a personality perspective, there's a gender perspective. And even though they all come down as these individual colors, at the end of the day, it's going to be mud right down here because they're all going to intermix and they're going to come together. That's what I have to design for. It's a whole lot easier to just design for experience in blue, isn't it? But no, I have to go complicated and design for mud. So we need to take a look at empathy. And how do we get empathy? How do we learn empathy? Well, people who have understood some form of trauma, and most of us have, we just need to recall what all of that is about. And that's how we can develop our empathy. So we start looking at things. So these are the things that I used. And I just started looking at images and saying, how would I have felt? Well, I just told you about looking out the window at the kids playing with their kites, and I couldn't. I can see the world out there, but I'm trapped behind the wall of despair. What does that mean? Or is that me, a plastic shell locked behind glass? If you could only see how broken I feel inside. Why do I feel broken? Because when I tried to play Little League, I ran to third base, ended up in a full-blown asthma attack, and had to be taken away in an ambulance. That was pretty darn traumatizing for me. And of course, nobody wanted me on their team after that. So I have to be a man, and I got to man up. I don't know why women don't have to woman up, but men have to man up, and I have to put on my happy face. So I wear the mask. And then the lens that we look through, if I can just get through today. I can't possibly think about tomorrow. I got to worry about getting through today. This is what forms my ability. So I think about these things, about how I felt. And then when Elke comes to the trauma care center and she tells me about what she went through, I draw upon my own personal experiences to try to understand where she went through. And then I'll ask her for some clarifying questions so that I can figure that out, because that's then going to inform. And of course, the last one is, where did I go? I no longer recognize the person in front of me. Now, I left that for later because that isn't something that affected me, but it may have affected Elke. Elke may look in the mirror and say, where did I go? What happened to the woman that I used to be? So this is all going into pre-design, and we're understanding our population and who are the people that are in our population. And this is where we have to try to understand who these folks are. So we look at this person here who's been through that natural disaster, earthquake, hurricane, whatever. And maybe it was somebody that she saw, that she knew from her classmate, that was trapped under that bridge. This older lady, this happened to my aunt, walked every single day, tripped on the sidewalk because there was an uneven portion of it, fell, broke her wrist, and stopped walking. Well, then she became more immobilized because she wasn't walking anymore. If you don't use it, you lose it. So that was her trauma. And then you got this guy here who's going through the spousal abuse. What does that mean? You know, as a man, I'm supposed to say big, strong, and protect myself, but you never hit a woman. So it's like, well, how do I do that? And then you got this girl here who lives in a disorganized community, and she watched her father be shot. One of the schools that I worked on was a school for trauma-informed design because it was in a disorganized community. And some of the things that those kids witnessed would be shocking to you. And then we wonder why they react the way that they do and why some of the behaviors are so explosive. And then we have this guy over here who suffered a hate crime. Don't know why. Maybe because he's a gay man, and that's why he had the hate crime. And this young lady over here, you'd think that life is great for her, but she was bullied. So she's never going to reach her full potential because of her own insecurities of being bullied. And then this guy was in combat duty. And where did I go? And then this young lady over here may have been raped in college. All sorts of different reasons why somebody goes through trauma. So if we just take a look at the one person, and let's just take a hate crime. And so we've got this guy right here. There are a lot of things in pre-design that are going to come forward. Most of this is going to be in organizations. So these are different organizations that fight for a particular agenda. These organizations will often influence our politics through policy. So in this guy's situation, maybe it's a policy that he can't marry the partner of his life. So, you know, you end up having policy that's driving that from the organization, because the politics don't really care. They only care about what the organization, what the people say. And this is then being echoed in television. So we see this in television and in movies and what have you, related to all of these types of traumas that we have. That often informs some of the familial beliefs. The organizations will do that, but so too will the politics. And that often relates then to our neighbors, which then relates to the badgering and the name calling. We can think about all of that, and even the media messages that we see on the news television. And that then goes to our self. Notice how that's all in capital. None of these things are done by mistake, because I'm really big on metaphor and foreshadowing. Self-perception. So then he has the hate crime. So how does he internalize it? I deserved it. I'm an aberration. I'm an abomination. I'm whatever. And then he develops his fear. And then these are the things that I have to design for. Hypervigilance. I already talked about that with the high back chair, because we already determined that Elke is not an owl. She cannot turn her head all the way around. So we have to protect the back of her head. Because if you remember that young lady that was bullied, twat, that's bullying. So we've got to protect her from that. He's going to be very reactionary. What's the reactionary? Sudden bursting of tears, standing up and fighting, throwing something at them. He may end up developing learned helplessness. It was my fault. I'm the aberration. It shouldn't have happened. It goes into that melancholy. Remember, we talked about that melancholy already with the young lady who was at the school and was held down, and then she felt bad. There's your melancholy. And then you have your anxiety. Intrusive memories come from association. So this could be something as simple as dropping a stapler and hearing that kaboom from dropping the stapler. Well, now that kaboom has an association with something else, which serves as a trigger. And then they develop that disassociation. They have anger, irritability, depression. And of course, you have your guilt and shame. That's what I'm designing for. When I go into design, these are my variables to understand with my design. And so when I take a look at that, I then look at the event. And here I have, I always forget I have to turn off the annotation. I have the pre-event. So what's the pre-event? The footsteps that I heard behind me, the smell of the autumn leaves, the breeze that was going on to my face. Then I have the event. Most people that have been in a fight know you don't feel anything, but your senses are all hyper. So you don't know why it is that you smell that cigarette smoke, or you smell that vaping scent from somebody who does vaping, or you see the type of shoe that they're wearing, or you feel the facial hair. That's during the event. Remember when I talked about that wall and why that was so important for the headlamps, and why it is that the erratic sparkle of lights become a problem? Post-event. The ambulances come with their sirens and their flashers. So this is all going into, these three things are all going into the internalization of the triggers that the person's going to have, intrusive memories. So all the things that have happened here. So we want to control those erratic, loud siren sounds. You also hear them in air raid sounds. So when your person's in a war or something, they're seeing the explosion, they're seeing the bright lights go off. So we need to create some separation there. So that's our pre-design phase. That's learning the pre-design. I've learned about the type of trauma. I know my user population. I try to understand their perspective, and I do it through empathy. Now what have I got to do? Well, now I got to design. Now designing, I have to start looking at the theoretical frameworks, and I think to myself, okay, what is it that I need? Okay, we already know that Elke's not an owl, so prospect refuge. That's going to be important. She wants to be able to see because she's hypervigilant. Remember, we have hypervigilance down here. So she wants to be able to see, but she doesn't want to be seen. How am I going to keep her concealed so that she can be vigilant, but she can also hide her own identity? Symbolic communication. This is where the shame comes from, or the guilt. I need to figure out a way to make sure that she is represented in a positive light, so that she feels comfortable in that environment, that she's not going to be judged or discriminated against or looked upon negatively. I need to take a look at the elements of legibility. And we already know that just fell out of my head. The Kevin Lynch's elements of legibility. Where are the landmarks? Where are the edges? Where are the nodes? What's going to be the district? How is that going to work? Why is that going to be important? Well, that's going to be important because I'm going to be reactionary. So I need to be able to find these things as quickly as possible. And the last thing I want to do is talk to Maria. So I need to make this as self-evident as possible. Information management, sight, sound, smell. Yes, smell. I want to control Who sees me? Because I know when Maria sees me, she's going to tell everybody in my neighborhood that I'm at the trauma care center and that I'm weak. I'm not a real man. And then I'm going to be faced off of all of that. No, Maria would never do that. I'm just making that up. So, but that is the information management. You don't know who's looking at you, who knows you. So you want to control who sees you. I certainly don't want people to hear me. And then a little known secret for those people who have gone through a traumatic physical experience, such as rape or a combat duty, is that sometimes you accidentally evacuate, meaning that you pee on yourself or poop on yourself, and there's certain scent that goes with that. So I need to control for that. I'm going to make sure that the environment itself is not too pleasurable, but also not unpleasurable. And this is the Maharabian and Russell pleasure arousal dominance theory. So I'm applying this. I want it to not be too arousing, but I do want it to be arousing in a positive way. But ultimately, I want self-empowerment because I don't want them to feel helpless. And there's a fine line between empowerment and helplessness. And so we want to make sure that that happens. And then I got to look at these associative meanings, what's going to happen around them that are then going to serve as triggers. So these are my theoretical frameworks that I'm constantly going to be grading any particular design from.
Dak, sorry to interrupt you. We just have to pay attention to the time. We have
10 minutes?
We would have now 10 minutes for questions because we have only 1 hour of conversation in total. So maybe if you could take 5 to get going with the slides, and then we have 5 for questions.
Okay. So take a look at this. This is space. This is what it is that I use to give grades. And then what I do from here is I look at design. So this is an actual place that I was consulting on. This one here, not good. Looming, got a tunnel effect. So I've got lots of sound reverberation, not very good. Here, I've got vision coming down from the second floor to the first floor. So I'm losing privacy, not a great design. Also, I've got that tunnel effect right here, which means that I'm getting lots of noise reverberation, not particularly great. Poor wayfinding, a straight unilateral front is not a great idea, and it's subjecting everybody to vision from somebody else. The orange side is the immediate trauma side. This is when somebody is being brought in from a traumatic event. The yellow side is for recurring. So you're basically giving wide exposure through a bank of windows here and a bank of windows here for the person who's been traumatized. Probably not a great design. Here, you've got your central area, which I call a swimming pool of triggers. So people are walking through, and not only are you being seen, but you're also hearing sound reverberation. Here, you've got a corridor, which I would not have. And again, I'm looking down. This is my optimal one that I chose. This is the administration or the police building. Yes, there's a corridor here, but our victims aren't going to be using it. It's slightly angulated in. I just want to change that a little bit, and I want to change this a little bit so that when the person who's traumatized goes in here, and then on the other side, they go there. So ultimately, this was our floor plan that we looked at. We rounded this out to reduce this swimming pool of triggers, rounded this out, put breeze block here so you can see through it. So now Elke can see through this design, but she can't necessarily be seen because remember, that's what we're trying to do with Prospect Refuge. And we've rounded this out to, again, reduce some of that. These are some of the areas where people can hide when they're inside. So you can face in. I'm going to actually show you that here. Here, I'm looking at the entryway. So we've just gone up. Where's my Prospect Refuge? I have none. So they get 0. Symbolic communication, got none. Elements of legibility. Yeah, I can kind of see where I need to go. There's probably a receptionist over here. Information management. Not a whole lot of information that's going on, but you got good eligibility. Your pleasure arousal dominance, it's kind of pleasurable. Luckily, they've got distressed leather. They've got a lower cost table here, and they've got the bean bags. So you've got a variety of people that can go here. So that's going to go to my associative meaning. This particular area here, I gave them a 65%, a D, solid D for that design based off of trauma. Here is a family waiting room where a trauma victim goes in through this door, which is where they then get checked out for physical injuries. This one here, you've got the prospect refuge, you've got the higher chair, which is nice. It would be great if it's swiveled because I don't necessarily want to look at the person in front of me. Sofa is against the wall, so that's good because I'm not an owl. There's an area here for children to play. So it is moderately pleasurable, but it is arousing. And I do have some control. If the chair swiveled, I would have even more control. Associative meaning, still not seeing a whole lot of that. So this design here, I gave them like a 78. So they got a good C+ on this design. Could be better. And then this is the hallway. You have your tuck-ins here. So if I see Maria walking down over here, I can walk over here. I'd want something engaging on this wall right here so that I'm not just simply facing the corner, but I'm pretending to look at something so that Maria's not seeing me. Got lots of sound control here, so that's good. Elements of legibility, kind of. I think that we're in pretty good shape. But one side is the interview room where the police officers are interviewing the victims. The other side is the family waiting room, which was this room here. And then there's the exam room right off of that. So I probably would have done a little bit different color or something over here to just signify that there's something different from side to side. Pleasurable arousal, yeah, it's okay. I'd give this one a good solid B in its design. I can increase some aspects for it. And again, I'm looking for these things right up here. This is what I'm trying to do. So as we start to look at our populations, there are many special populations that we can be looking at with trauma. And so I use these different methods where I'm identifying the criteria, I'm for the pre-design, then I'm looking at the theoretical frameworks that are most likely to apply for that person. That's how I analyze the design. When I analyze each of the design, I give it a grade. It's amazing what grades actually do to people. In the last company that I worked for, they're like, I want all A's. So we went through, I went with the designer to say, okay, this is how we can make those designs A's. We use a systematic or team approach because no one person knows everything. And when you ask me to bring in technology, I'm not going to be that person. You ask me to talk about structures or engineering, I am not that person. You want it to be absolutely beautiful and sophisticated, I am not that person. But I will be the person that'll design for your population. Bam.
That's it.
That's it. That's it. Bam.
This is a lot. So I already asked our students to cook up some questions. If they have questions, they can already come over here to the chair in front of the owl. Yes. So maybe I will make a question just to make it started, and then maybe they can come over. I think they need a little time maybe to just to process. So first of all, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. So complex and also quite moving in many ways to listen to it, because of course you shared with us your very personal story, your background story with this situation, and also your own personal experience of having such a difficult chronic illness such as asthma. And as a coincidence, talking about symbiotic action and reaction, I also had asthma as a child. And unfortunately could relate to some of the traumatic experiences you talked about, not being able to play with other kids and other kids. Also, parents can become overprotective. So you know how all these things can develop, and the impact that this has. So my first question to you is most of all has to do, because you mentioned that you were growing up in the 70s, and of course in the 70s we didn't have such a broad understanding of these topics. We didn't have the medications, and we probably didn't even have environmental psychology. So my first question to you would be to see, do you see that there has been a real significant progress in this field? So nowadays, if we have an asthmatic child, do you think that there is much more broad awareness, not just in terms of the design, so availability of design solutions, but also, for example, from the part of the parents, that they're able to understand that there's much more possibilities to offer good conditions for the children?
I think that we have seen an increase in one aspect, which is, of course, the knowledge of asthma, which brings about the medications and the awareness of asthma. But I think, as you've already pointed out, a lot of parents become helicopter parents, and they become too controlling of the child to allow the child to understand his or her own limits. I knew my limits. And we tend to look at the medications as the magic bullet. And that's where it comes from here, because I think that the medications are important, but I also think that the fact that I started competitive swimming helped, because it increased my lung capacity. As an asthmatic, you know that there are different levels of not being able to breathe. There's a tightness in the chest, and then there's the full-blown asthma attack. Once I started to swim and I was increasing my lung capacity, I found that I was getting the tightness in the chest, but I was never going into the full-blown asthma attack in my 20s. So I don't think that we as a society have moved away from the biomedical aspect to the environmental aspect enough to make this equal.
Well, also from the point of view of the design, we also don't think so much that even the objects of the everyday don't encourage, for example, they don't encourage much movement. An asthmatic child probably shouldn't sit for too long. They need to move so that the air flows, that they can connect to their own rhythm of breathing. This is something that I personally learned when I started to practice yoga in middle of my architecture studies. So I was already over 20. And after 20 years of basically almost constant bad health, I started to know what it was like to feel healthy, which was basically the reason why the conversations on corporeal architecture exist. That's how it all started. So would you say that also from the point of view of designers, first of all, it's not so long that we are really thinking about inclusive design. And at the same time, we do have niches of researchers who work for, we would say, non-normative bodies or bodies that have special needs. But as much as we know about the complexity of the human, we know that there's actually almost no normal human, because we all have our vulnerabilities and our frailties. So shouldn't this be perhaps one way, and now considering also all the war and trauma and destruction that we are going through after the pandemic, and now all these wars now happening, maybe trauma-informed design would really be one of the key aspects to consider design in the future. What would be your thoughts on it?
Well, the first thing that I want to say is that you made the comment that you started doing yoga and knowing what health was after you were 20. I didn't know what health was until after I was 17. And again, it was you and I who were taking control of our bodies at that time to fully understand what we can do. So the first thing that I would say is that if you're a parent of a child that has asthma, stop putting limits on that child, but let that child start to explore what they can and can't do, because they're going to find balance. They're going to find homeostasis. The way that you found it with yoga, I found it with swimming. So I think that that's an important thing. Trauma, absolutely. And I think that you highlighted it. We are all unique. And the way that we internalize these things is through that uniqueness. I think in order for good trauma-informed design to happen is for us to all draw upon our own personal experiences. That's what's going to help us to empathize. I'm not going to know exactly what a woman who has been raped feels or understand, but I can understand what it means to be locked behind that wall peering out. I know what that feels like. So I can start to understand a little bit about how she would understand. And that's going to help me design. So do I think that trauma-informed design is going to get more in the future? Absolutely. Absolutely. Between the pandemics, the disparity in incomes, and we're seeing more and more poor populations, the wars, the refugee status. I mean, there's a whole bunch that's coming on down the pipeline. And I do think that trauma-informed design is a niche that's going to need to be addressed by architects, interior designers, product designers, landscape architects, the whole 9 yards.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just before, so if there would be a question, one question here, I would be very glad if you could now come to the chair, because we also don't have so much time. We would have to finish. So I myself have only one final question for Dak, and it would be on the role of culture, because we know that different cultures relate probably to trauma also differently, because we have different, also we learn different ways of dealing with our bodies and with our feelings and what we can or not express, and there's also levels of taboo. So would you say that we also need to be, when working with trauma-sensitive design, that we also have to be sensitive to culture?
Oh, absolutely. And with culture then goes on to those gender norms and expectations. I mean, you got to be very aware that a female in one culture is going to view trauma very differently than a male in that same culture. I think, and even generationals. I mean, my parents look at some of these things that people experience in a very different way than my generation and the generation behind me. So age, gender, culture, all of that is going to be very important, and you really got to tap into it. And you've got to be very supportive when you're doing pre-design research to ask the right questions and ask it in such a sensitive way that people don't become offended by that. I think Elke had a question, but she was on mute.
Go ahead, Elke.
Just want to say thank you for this talk. It was very interesting, and I have to say that one of my friends died at 18 because of asthma, and he was the first friend of mine actually at young age who died. That was quite a shock for me and all my other friends. And also what to me recently was traumatizing was that when, I went abroad and I studied in different cities and I wanted to become really modern. And, so I was living in Berlin, my mother was living near Frankfurt, and suddenly she got really ill. She couldn't, she really needed help. She needed care. And I was so far away and just had a baby. And it really traumatized me to see my parents getting old and needing help. And it was also, I'm really scared of becoming really old and end up in a home for the elderly, especially if you don't have enough money to afford a really nice one, And this really sort of, I think is a very is an issue which is on my mind at the moment. So maybe you have some experience with like dealing with old people, and also because our society, I don't know how it is in the United States, but in Germany and Austria, it's all like a bit like people, like even in advertisement, everything is about being young and trying not to see how you age, and getting old is almost like you have to be ashamed of. It was different before, you would appreciate old people and you would listen to them, but now you get invisible. And so this is a thing I've been thinking about. How can you how can design help to still being a part of society, getting old, or even when I had a child very late, suddenly my life changed, because you were so you have to take care all the time of this child. My husband was traveling, and I was blocked out suddenly. And I think it has to do with space. If you want to change society, you have to change spaces. That was what Lefebvre once said. And that's just my thoughts who popped up during your talk, and thank you very much.
Lots of stuff there. You're absolutely right that society values are very much symbiotic to the built environment. I see that all the time, you know, being in Las Vegas, where we don't appreciate old buildings. We just blow them up and put up a new building. I mean, it's pretty hard to find people that haven't had some form of plastic surgery. Mostly, unfortunately, women, they tie their self-worth to that youth more so than males. But I mean, between the lip plumping and the breast augmentation and the frozen face from Botox, I mean, I see it every single day, you know, in Las Vegas. So I hear what you're saying. Interestingly enough, there's been some underground groups of people, mostly in Generation X, that have developed end of life packs. They've calculated how much money they have and when that money will run out, and that's when they are ostensibly going to pull the plug, because they no longer can afford to live longer. So I think that that's a trauma that a lot of people are feeling. I don't think that you're isolated in that. And I can just tell you that on the opposite end of the spectrum, a lot of guys are feeling terrible because they don't have money to provide childcare, and their wife has now had to give up their career, and they feel guilty because my generation, which I believe is probably your generation, we were more equal. We didn't believe that the guy had to be the one that made all the money, but we still live in that kind of a sexist society where men make more money. So they feel obligated to have to do that. And there's a guilt that our wives have to give up their careers. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack, but I think that if we could look at the symbiotic relationship between our society and our reverences, maybe we can change some of those social values. I don't know. I mean, that's really all that I've got for you. I do work with older populations, and the sad part is that it's usually those that are well off that I end up working with. And that worries me about design, is that we are catering to the wealthy, and it's become a luxury and not necessarily something that everybody is entitled to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you on that one.
No, there's no. I think I've been thinking of it since my parents became really old, and I had my best friend. She experienced similar things, and I think we are discussing of maybe forming a flat or a house share again. We used to live together when we were students, so we are thinking of different forms of living together. And I mean, my experience when I was old was that I grew up in a small village. Old people would sit on the bench outside of their house, and you would greet them and you would talk to them. And if they fell, you would help them to get up. But if they are in a little room with other old people, you don't see them anymore. You can't interact with them. So it's a problem of space, I guess, and how to live together. Yeah.
Well, not only that, but the advice that they gave. I mean, I also came from a small town, and I would listen to them, and they would warn me of the mistakes that they made, and I carried those with me. You know, I listened to their stories, and yeah, life changes from generation to generation, but ultimately it's all the same thing. So, you know, you learn from their mistakes. I mean, I think that's there's so much advice out there for older people to share with younger people, to help younger people to see things more clearly. I think so. I'm with you 100%. Symbiotic relationship. They help us, we help them, and there's a lot of good models out there that we could be working with, including the childcare. You know, you got some older parents that can take care of the kids. You know, so.
Yes. And usually the older ones have done already a lot of mistakes, and they tend to be better when they take care again the second, this next generation than the first one. Well,
absolutely.
unfortunately, we will have to finish for now because this is already a little late here in Germany, and our students we are already a little over time, so we will have to finish. But thank you again for your contribution. This was very interesting. I could imagine many ways to continue this conversation, and I hope that we will have a chance in the near future.
Yes, I do have to apologize. I thought it was an hour presentation and then 20 minutes of question and answer. So I misunderstood. So I apologize for going over.
No problem. So thank you again. And I hope that we can again continue soon with this or maybe other threads of the discussion. And thank you also, Elke and Sonia, for being here, and also to the students for your attention.
Yeah, thanks for not getting up and leaving. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.